All right, good morning, everyone. Before we start today's actual lesson, I want to go over how we could grab projects, install all of the requirements TXT into our own Python environment, and be able to run them. So currently right now, there's this Pokédex underscore DB. I may have that database living in my local machine prior to, or I may not. But I want to make sure that I don't have it, just in case there's been any changes. I could apply migrations without running into any conflicts. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this specific command. I'm going to drop DB. I'm going to drop the Pokédex database, and then I'm going to create DB, and that's going to create the Pokédex database. So I'll go ahead and run that. It drops it and creates it. If I open up another shell, I can now enter Pokédex underscore DB. Okay, so it works. It's been created. And if I look at the connections, it's going to tell me, hey, there's nothing here. There's no relations. All right. So the next thing, I have this requirements txt, and we can notice that I don't have a Python virtual environment, nor do I have anything activated. So I'm going to walk through the process of demonstrating how to make a Python virtual environment again, just so everyone's tracking. So I'm going to go ahead, run python-m venv env, and that's going to create this env file. Okay, so I'm going to say source env bin activate, and then I'm going to pip install -- upgrade. Okay. Okay, so that is upgraded my pip. My pip's good to go, and my virtual environment is now activated. Okay, well, currently right now, if I run pip list, we can see that all I have inside of my pip right now is pip itself and setup tools. But I need everything that's inside of requirements txt. So can anybody tell me what that command is to install requirements txt into pip?
Pip freeze greater than requirements txt.
Yeah, so that's for dumping everything that's inside of my pip onto a requirements txt file. But for installing everything that's inside of my requirements txt, I'm going to say pip install -r, which means recursively. And if we look at requirements txt, they're all individual lines. So it's going to go through, grab one line, install it, go to the next one, install, next, next, and next. All right, so it's going recursively. And what I want to install is going to be requirements txt. And now when I run it, we can see that it's collecting everything that was inside of requirements txt. It's grabbing the ASGRF, AutoPep8, grabbed Django, PsychoPG binary, grabbed everything that I needed. So now let's go ahead and make sure that worked by running pip list one more time. And now in pip list, we can see that I have all the environmental variables that were passed in requirements txt. And that's the entire purpose behind making requirements txt altogether. All right.
Francisco,
Oh, yeah, of course. Go ahead.
how do we freeze the requirements into the text file again?
Yeah, so that's going to be pip freeze. And then I'm going to specify the path of where it is that I wanted to freeze it. That's what this right arrow means. And I'm going to say, I want to do it at the root level, and I want you to put it in requirements txt. And now requirements txt would be updated, of course. All right, so that looks like everything I need for setup, but my database is still empty. What do I need to do in order for my database to have relations?
You need to migrate your data.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and Python manage py migrate. I don't need to make migrations because those are already live inside of the migrations folder. All right, and we can see here that Pokemon moves is in there, and so is Pokemon, I believe. Oh, so here's Pokemon app, and then here's the move app. Okay. So all of those have been added in there. And now I can say, now since it's been migrated, I can go ahead and take a look here, run /d, and everything populates along with my move app, which we can see here, and my Pokemon, which we can also see there. Okay, now let me check make sure that we have some sort of fixtures. Okay, it seems like the Pokemon app has fixtures, but the Move app doesn't. So we may have to create a couple of moves real quick. So I'm gonna go ahead and install this fixture. So I'm gonna say Python manage py load data. And the data that I want to install is from Pokemon data.json. And we see that 3 objects from 1 fixture when installed. I'm going to make sure that happened by running a select all from Pokemon app, Pokemon, and we can see Pikachu, Charizard, and Blastoise are all inside. So now let's go ahead and keep moving on here. What's the next thing that I need? Well, I need some moves. So I'm just going to make some moves really quickly, and I'm going to look at my model to ensure that I can make some moves. Let's see. What do we have? We have name, which doesn't have a default value. Everything else is a default value, so I don't need to worry about it. So I just need to ensure that everything has names. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and enter the Python shell. I'm going to say from move app dot models import move. And then I'm going to say my move 1 is equal to move where name is equal to psychic. So my move 1 dot save. Okay, what else do we want other than psychic? Anyone could think of a name?
Thunderbolt.
Flamethrower.
Thunderbolt. So thunder. Can I have spaces here? I don't think I can have spaces. Can I? Let's try it. Yeah, flamethrower. Okay, and then let's just do Hydro Canyon. That way we have 1 move per Pokemon for the most part. Flail. Yeah, we can put that one in there too. Why not?
Emotional abuse.
Aren't those all saving to the same variable name?
Yeah, so I'm overriding the variable name and then just saving the new move in there.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna go ahead, select all from move app, move, and we can see Psychic, Tackle, Thunderbolt, Flamethrower, Hydro Canyon, and Flail. All right, so now I have all these. Currently I have these Pokemon, but these Pokemon don't have any connections. So let's go ahead and grab each one of those Pokemon. So I'm gonna say from move app dot models. Excuse me, not move app, but we want Pokemon app. And I want to import Pokemon. Okay, so now let's grab Pikachu first. Or actually, I'm just going to overwrite this. So I'm going to say Pokemon. And the first one is I'm going to grab by ID. I'm going to say Pokemon dot objects dot get, where the ID is equal to 1. That's going to give me Pikachu, hopefully. Oh, and I missed the S on objects. Okay, so now I can say Pokemon, and we can see that it's a Pikachu that has been captured. Okay, so now I can say, well, Pikachu has a moves field, and let's take a look at Pikachu or the Pokemon field real quick. So we're doing this correctly. Okay, so we do have a moves field, so I'm going to go ahead and say dot moves. Excuse me, not Pikachu, we want Pokemon dot moves dot add. And here I wanted to have Thunderbolt, so I'm going to take a look here. Thunderbolt is 3, so I'm going to say 3. And then I'm gonna save it. So now I'll repeat the process. Instead of 1, I want 2. I want to see what that Pokemon is. Well, that's Charizard. So Charizard should have some probably a fire type, so that's 4. And then lastly, 3. We can see that this is going to be Blastoise. I want to add a move, and in this case, I want to add number 5 for Hydro Canyon. And then I'm just going to save it. Okay, now to make sure that everything worked, well, let's say I go to print Pokemon.moves.all. And we can see that this current Pokemon, which is Blastoise, has a move of Hydro Canyon and so on. And we'll actually get to see each individual one later on, but we'll stop here as far as project setup goes.
I got a question real quick.
Question.
Yeah. of
Oh,
course.
sorry. Go ahead, Michael.
Just on the how you reference it, Pokemon.moves, if you had a related name in your many-to-many moves field, would you have to reference it by that related name? It's just because you don't have one that you call it moves.
So here I don't have a related name inside of my Pokemon. Well, I do have a related name. Actually, no, I don't. But my Pokemon, right, has access to that many-to-many relationship by the variable that I gave it, not the related name. So if I want to get a related name, I would say comma related name equal to Pokemon. And then that way my move has a Pokemon list of all the different Pokemon that know this move.
Well, I just wanted to clarify, if you did have a related name, you would not type Pokemon.moves. You'd have to type Pokemon.that related name. Is that how that would work if you did?
No, that's incorrect. So Pokemon itself is a Pokemon instance. So every time I want to access the moves that belong to Pokemon, it will always be through .moves because that is the variable that I gave it. The related name does not affect my Pokemon model. It would affect my move model.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Of course.
The default one there in the moves. Did we figure out why the default wasn't getting put in when the class was made?
Yeah, we actually did. Myself and Umar went down this huge rabbit hole. And so everyone is tracking. There's a way to give a default value, but there's a lot more setup that needs to happen in the background. And myself and Umar decided that it was a little out of scope for the class to go that in depth into what's going on in behind the scenes. And as soon as I said that, I realized Katie's background. So I apologize, everyone. Yeah, it was a little too in depth to discuss it with the class right now. But we'll definitely save that knowledge for later on. And once we finish all of the course material that we want to make sure everyone solidifies, we'll go back and clarify how we could add a default for a many-to-many fields.
So for the way that it's set up right now, you actually don't need that default equals 1 to do what you've just done in the terminal, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Hey,
Alright.
Francisco, can you explain one more time for me how there's no conflict when you set all these different moves to the same variable name, move 1?
Yeah, so it's called I don't know how to explain it here. Let me see. Let's say I make my number be equal to 5, right? And then I run my number. Well, my number is now equal to 5, but this is just a variable, right? So now I can just say, well, I don't want my number to be equal to 5 anymore. Now I want it to be equal to a string that says 5. And now if I run my num, well, my num has a different value of a string of 5. So I'm just grabbing the same variable and overriding its value.
Makes
Okay.
sense. Thank you.
Of course, no
But
problem.
they still saved to your database with a unique key. Is what you're saying?
The value goes into the database in the unique key. Yes. Again, this is
Okay.
just a variable. I was grabbing each individual Pokemon and changing the value by the ID.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. What did I import to access the Pokemon class? From, oh, I see somebody else answered it. Okay, perfect.
Francisco, I just realized that the moves.add, that was causing me a lot of issues. So like a query set would come up empty for me as well. And I just realized that you going through it in the shell, doing Pokemon.moves add is what adds moves to the Pokemon instance. The README for that was a day 2, part 2, did not have the add at all. So I think that's what that was throwing the blank.
Oh, thank you for letting me know that. I will definitely make sure to go ahead and adjust that. Thank you. All right. Okay, so now we went over project setup. That took a little bit of time. But before I keep moving on forward, there's something else that I would like to do. I created all of this data, but there's a good chance that I'm going to have to manipulate this information. So with that said, I should probably back up my information. So how could I do that?
Do the dump.
Yeah, I could do the dump data and create some fixtures, right? And let's take a look at what that looks like here. So I'm going to say Python manage py dump data, and specifically I'm going to start with Pokemon. Pokemon app.pokemon, because that's the model that I wanted to grab. And I want it to look nice and clean, so I'm going to give it this indent2 argument. I want it to go into Pokemon app slash fixtures slash Pokemon data.json. Okay, so that seems like it was able to work. If I take a look here, well, everything has been updated. Now we see this moves field here, and it's interpreted as a list once I go ahead and dump it in my data. And I have a list of the different moves that my Pokemon knows. All right. And let's actually give this, actually, let's go into our move now and do the same thing for move. And let me make sure that this has a fixtures folder. I would typically do it through the terminal, but because my terminal is handling this right now, I don't want to leave it. And I'm just going to change this to move data. Okay, so finally, the last thing I want to do is I want to change this for move app dot move. And now we can see that inside my fixtures folder, I have this move data. And that's it. Now I have everything backed up. I have all of my moves, and I have my Pokemon ready to go. Okay, so now that's enough for project setup. Before I continue pushing, if we could afford maybe five minutes to any questions that anyone has as far as setting up the project, please go ahead and ask now.
Sorry, is this generally the way we would do it standardly, or is it more like if we had our own project where we custom building, like there's not a set order that we should be trying to remember to do these things, right?
Yeah, there's definitely not a set order. They should be definitely trying to do these things. It's just, this is you got to figure out how to get to the end state that you want. And these are all different tools that you can utilize to get there. All right.
What was that code you put in for the moves again?
Right here.
So we're still dump data Pokemon underscore app. We just move, is that the same for moves?
Yeah, I'm trying to find the move.
I see it right there. It's the one, yeah, that
There.
one.
There.
Okay, so no, it's dump data move app. Okay.
Right.
Just want to make sure.
Okay.
And the sorry to one more question. In the beginning when you started this, you did I kind of missed it. I was a bit distracted with some stuff. Did you disassociate the database, or what exactly did you do at the very beginning that had you had to go through and reload Django and pip and everything?
Yeah, so I actually dropped the database and then created the database. I did drop DB, Pokédex, and then create. Oh, I did drop DB and create DB Pokédex.
What was the purpose of dropping the database instead of just continuing on with what you had from before? Is it just from the troubleshooting you were doing yesterday?
It was for demonstration purposes, so that if you, it was to demonstrate what would happen if you were pulling someone's project that you've never touched before, right? Especially once you guys are working in your backend team, maybe someone starts the project layout and then shares it with the rest of the team. But now you're able to grab their Django project and install it into your machine yourself.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Of course, no problem.
Do we have to create that fixtures folder?
The fixtures folder, yes,
Okay, so we have to create that before we do the dump data.
correct. When you data dump into the JSON, are you able to get the actual names of the moves with the Pokemon? The actual names of the moves inside of the Pokemon JSON data, no, you are not. It would only provide the IDs there. Okay,
Francisco, real quick, sorry, did you delete your virtual environment from yesterday, or did you just deactivate it and then reactivate it? It looked like you created a new one today.
right, this is a brand new one. And again, this was to demonstrate to everyone how you would work with somebody else's project. With this being a brand new one, I installed requirements TXT.
Okay, but if we were working on a project like throughout an extended period of time, we just deactivate the environment and then just reactivate it, and it's the same one that we're working with.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Of course. All right, let's go ahead and get into our lecture today. So today we're going to be talking about RESTful APIs, or just APIs in general. Well, what are APIs? So here we have this nice little image here, and we've already messed around with an API, which was the Poke API. And then we had an activity where we all touched other APIs. We were concentrating in that specific assignment on the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, which is what happens here on the web application. But when you send that request, that goes over to the API, and then it hits the web server. So the web server currently right now is essentially our Django project, right? And our Django project is what's doing this connection to the database. And so far, we've just been working with this specific arrow, the one how our server talks to our database. Today, we're going to be focusing on the remainder of this entire loop. We're going to see how a specific application can send a request over to our server, and how our database sends that data back to the server so that the server can send it back to our application. Okay, so when we're thinking about an API and the way it functions, we can think about Facebook or Instagram or any type of web application out there that has a pretty good and substantial amount of data. Well, when we load it into the application, let's say you have really low internet connection, sometimes you get that little circle that spins. I'm not sure if that's still what we get nowadays, but I'm sure there's some sort of loading icon that happens when you log into Facebook if you have low internet connection. Well, that loading icon, what it's doing is it's just giving you something to stare at while the request is being sent to the server. And then once the request comes back from the server, or the response comes back from the server, that's when it starts displaying all of the content. And we know that that's what the HTML and CSS is handling on the front end. Yeah. So we open up Facebook, there's some sort of function that will ping this API. And then that API will see that it's going to send a GET request, just like we saw with the Poke API. And that GET request would go over to something like this. This is definitely not what their API would look like, but this is for demonstrational purposes. All right. Whenever we create our own API, if its purpose is to be an API, we want to make sure that we, one, specify that it's an API. So that's the first slash there after the domain. And then after that, we want to specify what version of the API we're working on. So this is going to be version 1. And then slash, thank you so much, Robert, for sending that in the chat. And then right after that, what is it that I want to see? Well, I want to see all the posts. So it's going to go to post, and then their server will go ahead and do all of the logic to query the database and grab all of the posts from the people that I have as friends. which sounds like a many-to-many relationship, right? So I would go into my many-to-many relationship, find all of my friends' posts, load all of their posts into one huge response, and then send it. And I'm sure it's not all of their posts, right? Because we typically get to the bottom and then we do that scrolling back up and then it loads more. So there's probably a limit on how many posts it's going to send to me. I get all of my posts, I scroll to them, I get to the bottom, it sends another request to the server saying, hey, this guy can't get off his phone, so we need more posts. And then it's going to ping the database again, grab more of my friends' posts, and then send them back to me, and so on. All right, so just in that part in general, do we have any questions so far? Okay, self-explanatory. Let's keep pushing forward. So now we got the web server. So this is where the request is actually being handled. It's what hosts all of our endpoints, which is the URL, and it's what actually does all the logic. And here's our database. So now once we get our get, put, post, or delete request, which is our querying, right? We want to make sure that get is for grabbing information out of the database. Put is for changing information inside of the database. Post is for creating information inside of the database. And then delete, well, that's just for deleting information out of the database. All right. And I think we've gone over that pretty extensively so far. Does anyone have any questions over those two? Okay. So now here's the flow. So it sends a request. It says, I want to get all posts. It sends it to the URL, all right, which is our RESTful API. The URL then sends it to our server, and then our server goes into our view handlers or model view controllers. They're called MVCs. And then it's going to send a query to the database. So here I want to select all from posts. So it goes into a database, the database query comes back, and then the query returns the post to the server. Our model view controller then grabs that response, makes it nice and neat, and turns it into whatever format it is that we need it to be in, sends it back to the URL, and then sends it back to the application. And that's the way this, I guess, cycle of operations works here. All right, does anyone have any questions over what we just covered?
Yeah, I have a question. So you said that the web server, that's currently our Django project. And if you look back at the reading that we had, it was about the MVCs and you had the viewer and the controller and stuff. So what part are we working on now with our web server? Like, where does that fall in?
Yeah, so currently what we've been working on is only the interaction between the web server and the database. All right, so only this portion is all we've been working on, this specific arrow. What is it that the web server needs from the database, and what is it that we want our database to look like with the web server? And today we're going to start focusing on grabbing things from the database to get into our server and then send it to the client. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and move into our lesson. So today we're going to be utilizing this specific, I guess, add-on to Django, which is called Django REST Framework. Now, Django REST Framework, and I'm going to demonstrate both how it works without Django REST Framework and then how it works with Django REST Framework so that we can appreciate what's going on. So Django REST Framework is specifically created for APIs. And what it does is it provides us a bunch of different things. I wonder if they have their documentation here. I don't want to take too much time to go into everything. Okay, yeah, so they specifically made for Django, so we can see how it integrates pretty quickly. It's going to give us a couple of permission classes that we can apply, and it gives us here an example of different permission classes that we can add on there. Later on, when we get to authentication, we'll learn about token authentication and how to handle user tokens. But basically, this is going to let us specify which types of responses it is that we're going to utilize. It's going to let us handle the request altogether. And it's going to let us just work with our actual information in a much cleaner fashion, as well as what we're able to send out or receive from each type of request. So let's go ahead and take a look at some code at this point. So the next thing that we have is views. Well, what are views? Why do I need to have views? And we talked about model view controllers earlier. So let's go ahead and get into that. I'm going to go ahead and pip install Django REST framework. Okay, so that installs Django REST framework. Now it's included in my EMV. And since I just installed something, I also want to make sure that it gets added into my list. So I'm going to say pip freeze requirements.txt. Okay, so that dumps into requirements.txt. And now we can see that Django REST frameworks has been added in there. Okay, so let's start off with Pokemon. All right. The first thing that I want to do with Pokemon, well, actually, the first thing that I want to do with my entire server is I want to connect the ability to ping this API. So let's go over to a Pokédex project, and we see this urls.py. Well, if I look at urls.py, we see this admin here, and then it goes to admin site.urls. We've utilized the admin site, right? And if I run my server, we can see that it's at localhost, right? And if I do /admin, well, then it takes me to my admin site. So here I have admin. So it's telling me that after this, after my local host gets deployed, and this is where any trailing information that I have will be triggered. So now let's go ahead and add a path here. I want right now, my project has no access to my Pokemon app. So I'm gonna make it include my Pokemon app, and I'm going to add that separate path here in my URL patterns. So I'm going to say path. We know that I wanted this to be API because I'm creating an API. It's going to be version 1. And then we typically want to pluralize whatever it is that we're doing here. And I believe the plural version for Pokemon is Pokemon. I don't think it's Pokemons, but if anyone knows off the top of their head, please feel free to correct me. And then after that, I'm going to go ahead and say include. Well, what is it that I want you to include? Pokemon says. All right, so what I want this to include is I want you to include my Pokemon app. And I want you to grab the URLs file inside of my Pokemon app. Okay, so this is great. I have this, but currently if I look at my Pokemon app, do I have a URLs file?
No.
Okay, so I don't have a URLs file. So I'm gonna go ahead and create one real quick. I'm gonna say urls.py. And essentially I want it to look somewhat the same as this. So I'm gonna go ahead and go into from Django.urls, and I'm going to import path. So now from here, I'm gonna go ahead and say, well, I want you in this path, I want you in this file first to have URL patterns because I'm going to have multiples of them. And I want you to create a path. And here, I just want this to say hello. So let's go ahead and create this function real quick. And it's actually a little hard to just dive right into this. So I'm going to go ahead and go into views next, because this path won't actually be able to render anything unless I specify a view. So I'm going to do it all within this file currently right now, but later on we'll see how it falls inside of the views file. So let's go ahead and state function, right? So def, I'm going to define a function. I'm just going to say hello. And this is actually going to take in a request, because as we know, whenever we send a request, it needs to have a way to handle that request. Okay, well now, in this request, what I'm going to do is I'm going to return. I'm going to just import something really quickly to display on the screen, but please don't let this affect you. This is only for demonstrational purposes.
And I'm lost.
Are you really?
No, I'm kidding.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to return an HTTP response here. And I'm just gonna have this HTTP response say, hello. Okay, and I believe that's all my HTTP response here needs. So I'm just gonna say hello. Okay, I'm gonna crash my server. I'm gonna run it again to make sure it's working properly. Oh, don't want it that way. All right, so it says hello, takes in requests, and it returns a specific sort of response. We'll go into responses here shortly. But first, I want to make sure everyone understands URL patterns. So we got this URL in our project. I'm actually going to close this. And it's going to API v1 Pokemon. So let's take a look here. Let's copy that. Let's go into our site. We know that at localhost, we should just be seeing the rocket, but now we don't see the rocket. Now we just see, hey, I have no idea what URL pattern you're trying to go to. Currently, these are the only two URL patterns that exist. So if I go to the right of that, place a slash, and then paste what I have, well, now we see that an HTTP response was sent, and I'm displaying hello. All right, and if I take a look here and I inspect the element, I can actually look at the body, and we can see that the body has an H1 of hello, which is exactly what I told it to do. And let's take a look at the network tab while it builds. Okay, the network tab doesn't really show me much currently. So we'll get into the network tab maybe a little bit later. But we can see how this is working now. So it sends the request to API/v1/Pokemon. After it sends that request, it goes to this path in my project, API v1/Pokemon. And then it says, well, I want to include the URLs here. Okay, so I come over to the URLs and I'm saying at an empty string, so meaning I'm not adding anything after that, just grab the same one that I had from project and respond with this. Well, I want to respond with say hello, and that's just going to send an HTTP response of say hello. And that's what allows us to actually display content in the front end.
So is this just like a little, like very much miniaturized version of what we're going to be doing with requesting our API in our project?
That is, yes, correct. Something very, very small.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Sorry, can you go back to the Pokédex project URLs?
Yeah, can you break it down like exactly what you're doing and why? Like what is it doing?
Yeah. So I bring include because I know that I want to make sure and I want to grab all of the URLs from my Pokemon app. I'm going to specify a specific URL pattern that I want my project to be able to handle.
And you're making that one up, right? That's just like whatever you want to call it.
That's correct. Yes. But because we're creating a RESTful API, we want to make sure that it's prefaced by API and the version. And then we want to pluralize whatever it is that this is supposed to do. So this is going to bring back all of my Pokemon here shortly. But currently, I just wanted to grab, I just wanted to show that HTTP response. So that's why I named it Pokemon. So after that, I go to include this file. So it goes into my Pokemon app and grabs my URLs. And then here on line 8, it's saying, well, this is an empty path. So this is what I'm supposed to send whenever that goes to API v1 Pokemon. And it's going to trigger this specific function, which is say hello. Now, because this is treating requests and it's an API response, like it's handling, it's a view, and it's handling the information that's being sent back to the server, it has to take in an argument named request. So that's why I pass request there. And then this is what it's returning in that specific request. So it takes in the get request, and this is the response that my server is sending back to my client. Does that make sense, Roger?
Yeah, so essentially all we're doing is just making connections between the main project and its individual apps. And then I'm assuming from here, from the URL file that you're in this app, you can link it to other places as well.
Yeah, we could definitely link it to other places, and that's actually gonna move forward with our lesson. So I'm gonna go ahead and keep pushing forward here so that we can move with our demonstration. All right, so again, this is all useful and all, but I don't want to create this the way I have it. I actually want to create an API. So now I'm going to go over to views and I'm going to say, well, I want there to be a specific response that's coming straight from my database. So there's a couple of things that I'm going to have to import here. So currently I have this render, but let's say I bring in get objects, or actually we'll leave it that. I want to make sure that I bring in the model that I have. So I'm going to say from .models, I want you to import Pokemon because I know I'm going to need the Pokemon. And now we're going to come to a couple of imports from REST framework. So from REST framework .views, I want to import API view. And we'll go into what that does for us here shortly. I also want to, I'm not going to go over response just yet. So let's take a look here. I'm going to start a class. And this one, I'm just going to say it's supposed to happen for all Pokemon. And now originally we had to take in a request, but API view, what this does is it's going to say that all of our functions within this, all of these methods within this class that have the API view are going to have a way of handling said request. So now we ourselves don't have to specify, hey, this request is going to be handled in X, Y, and Z. Instead, we're going to go ahead and outsource that part of a functionality to go to the API view. And I see your hand there, Ethan. What's up?
Is there anything else we need to have pip installed to get the from REST framework .views?
You should have called pip install REST framework.
Yeah, I did that, and yeah, nothing.
Same here.
It's not coming up for me as like being able to or to pull from there.
Okay, yeah, we'll definitely talk about that afterwards. That's a problem with your VS Code. It's not recognizing your work environment. But we'll go over that during lunch or after the lesson.
Okay.
Everything that you do though will still function even though it's under yellow squigglies and it doesn't highlight. It's still working.
All right. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Okay, so it seems like maybe that's something I should address before we go out for lunch today. So I'll make sure that everyone gets that information. All right, so now we have class all Pokemon. I'm going to pass in the API view. And that's going to let me handle different types of requests. Now, there's a lot of things that go into API, but the main things that we're going to focus are going to be the 4 typical requests, which is get, put, delete, and post. There you go. All right, so let's concentrate on get first. So I'm going to say def get, because that's what I wanted to treat. I wanted to treat get request. And we know that it's a class, so it needs to take in self. And now because it's an API view, I need to pass in request. Okay, so now I have self, it has request. That's great. But currently, what is it that I wanted to return, right? I can definitely return some sort of response or HTTP response, but I want to actually grab it from my database. So now here's where the database interactions come. So I'm going to go ahead and create a variable named all of my Pokemon. And I'm going to say Pokemon.objects.all. And let me just write the SQL query here so that everyone can see what we're doing. So here I'm saying select all from Pokemon. That's all this is doing. And now I want to print all Pokemon. And then just for demonstrational purposes, we'll bring back that HTTP response. So let me grab that from the URLs here. And actually, I'm gonna say from Django dot. Ooh, is it HTTP? Let's see, import. Okay, we'll just go with JSON response at this point. And the difference between HTTP and JSON, well, HTTP, we can see that we can write purely HTML here and return an HTTP. And JSON, well, that will only return a dictionary with JSON elements inside of it. So let's take a look here. Let's specify I'm going to return a JSON response. And let's say greeting or get was true. Okay, so all of this be coming together now. I'm gonna kill my server and run it again, and we'll see the error that I'm getting. So it's gonna say my path, say hello, doesn't exist. So if I take a look over here, we can see say hello does not exist. That's right. I have to grab my views and I have to import this specific type of view. Well, in this case, I wanted to import all Pokemon. And now I'm going to specify that the view I want to utilize is all Pokemon. And I wanted to grab that class and treat it as a view. And that's what as view is doing. Saying grab that class, treat it as a view. Well, now let's take a look at what's going on here. And this is a good spot to go ahead and introduce Postman. So we mentioned Postman earlier. Let me grab this here. All right, so Postman, it's just a way to test out your APIs. We can see that I have other things that I was testing out before. But currently in this project, it's going to HTTP : it's grabbing my local host, what it's sharing. But now I have this /pairs. If I want to get all of my Pokemon, and let me see if I can zoom in here. Okay, perfect. Yeah, if I want to grab that response that I want from all Pokemon, I have to ping the correct URL. So where do I grab the correct URL pattern that I'm supposed to post after my local host? Okay, Ivan, that's important. Thank you for saying that. Let me address your questions. What's up?
No, I feel like we're just I feel like we're running at like 1,000,000 miles a minute and just jumping into the Postman without having a complete understanding of URL is kind of I know I'm gonna have to rewatch this. This is probably a me problem. Maybe I'm the only one. But yeah, I think I really couldn't exactly say where I am still confused, whether it's in the URLs or the views part or the packages that we're importing. So
okay, yes, I'm looking at the chat and it seems like there's a couple of people. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish out this process and then I'll go back and break down everything step by step to ensure that everyone's tracking what's going on. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and grab that pattern and I'm gonna grab it from my paths. We know that this is the basic path, so I can't grab it from here. So I need to grab it from over here. So I'm gonna go here into Postman, and I'm going to say, hey, I want you to send a GET request to HTTP : / my local host, and then the URL pattern that I set up. Okay. Well, now when I send this, we see that I get back a response, and this response is coming from Django. We see that it says get, it has a colon, and it says true. Well, now let's take a look at our server and what's going on there. Well, now in our server, we see that we received a GET request. It went to API v1 / Pokemon, and then sent back the response. And we'll go into what these other numbers here mean here shortly. But I want to make sure that everyone is tracking. We see this query statement, this query set that's coming back that has all of my Pokemon in there. Well, that's happening from my print statement, right? So I was able to interact with my database where I grabbed all of my Pokemon. And then afterwards, I printed them out into the terminal. Now this doesn't get triggered until it gets the GET request. So let's go over what we've done so far and break it down step by step. So we have everything completed. We had our API, we had our project set up, but we didn't have any URL routes. So we went into our Pokédex project, and our URL file on our Pokédex project is what handles all of our different URL patterns. that we want to send to each individual app. Well, here we specified a different path. I'm saying, hey, I want you to keep track of this path, which is API, V1, and Pokemon. And this is just going to handle anything that belongs to the Pokemon app. So because I know it's going to handle anything that belongs to the Pokemon app, I want you to include, and in these quotation marks, right? Although maybe we think that this is a URL pattern, it's not. All I'm doing is I'm basically specifying an import statement. I'm saying what I want you to include is everything that's inside of the Pokemon app.urls. So it goes into the Pokemon app, clicks on URLs. Okay, and then after it goes into URLs, I specify this entire thing again, where I'm telling it, hey, these are the URL patterns that I want you to keep track of. I have to grab path from Django URLs because that's the only thing that allows me to create paths. And then I brought in this view from my views file. Well, we'll go into why this view is important. Well, now it goes into the URL patterns because I told it to include this file. And I'm telling it, I want you to assess the path where we have an empty quotation marks. And if we look at Postman here, we don't have anything follow on. I don't necessarily have an empty quotation marks, but we don't have anything following on. If I put something like /1 and I send it, I'm going to get an error, right? Because this URL pattern doesn't exist. And if I go back to Django, we can see, hey, I don't know how to handle this. I have no idea what this person is looking for. So it returns a 404 not found. It's saying this URL pattern doesn't exist for me, so I can't find it. I have no idea where it is. So if I go back to Postman and I fix it, and I send the request again, we see that it goes into the correct URL pattern, and it's able to execute its entire logic and return a 200, status 200, which means it was successful. So now it goes into URLs, went to the path, hit the empty path, and then it says, okay, well, what is it that you want me to do at this empty path? So now path is expecting a behavior, right? Well, I want this empty path to trigger this class, and I want you to treat it as a view. So then Django says, okay, well, where's that class coming from? Well, now it goes into my import statement. It says, okay, well, it's coming from views. So then let's take a look at views. Finally, it goes in here. And it says, all right, well, now there's this class named all Pokemon. But what is it that this class is going to do? Well, I utilized Django REST frameworks to tell it that this is going to be an API view. So now Django says, oh, okay, well, this is an API view, which means there's specific functionality inside of this API view that I'm supposed to be looking for. And one of those views is the get method, right? So if I send a get request, the get method is what will get triggered. So it goes into the get method. The self doesn't matter. It's just syntax because we're utilizing a class, right? But the request does matter because the request is actually what's coming in. So who's sending this request? Why is it being sent? Is there parameters inside of that request, et cetera, et cetera? But we'll go into requests here shortly. Okay, so now it says, all right, well, now I'm inside of the get. It seems like they're handling the request. What is it inside this method that they want me to do? Well, Django pings our database, grabs all of our Pokemon. It prints all of our Pokemon like I asked it to. And here we see the query set of it being printed. And then after that, I just simply tell it to return a JSON response. So it's returning something that's JSON, meaning that it could only be in a dictionary, right? Because we know that JSON can only be written in key pair values. So it returns a response where there's a dictionary inside of it with the key of get and the value of true. And now if I go ahead.
Go ahead, continue, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so now if I go into Postman, we can see the dictionary that I stated, and we can see the key of get and the value of true. Now notice that this true is lowercase, and it's coming with the lowercase t. Well, that's because Django knows it's sending a JSON response, and Django's behind the scene. After I tell, it turns all of my Python code that's inside of that specific block into JSON. And that's why this true comes back lowercase. Okay, so that's a quick breakdown over everything we've done. At this point, I hope that was able to clarify things enough to bring up questions. And it's important that we ask questions because this is something really fundamental. So please, any questions, go ahead and ask now.
Hey, Francisco, so just so I think this is how I get it. Our project has a URLs like set up. And as long as we have somewhere else to go, we're going to keep adding URLs to it. We're going to keep adding to that URL. Our project sends us to our app that has a URL. When that ends, it sends us to our view, which has what we're trying to put on the screen. So it goes project, app, view, and then it goes project, app, views, and then whatever we're putting on the screen from there, depending on if we post, get, delete, or whatever, right? Is that like close?
That's exactly what's going on. Correct. All right, Ethan.
So, I may have missed it. So what is the postman doing in this instance? So we're putting in our URL and then we're just hitting send on it.
Yeah, so Postman is just strictly pinging our API. There's different types of requests. For example, I can change it to
So you're hitting get too.
get. But currently the only one that I'm handling is get request. So that's why Postman is only handling get and sending that request. Does that answer your question, Ethan?
Yeah, so it's just okay, so it's just sending the request to that makes sense. Basically just testing it. Okay.
Right. We could go over making an entire HTML file with an input form that every time we click a button, it pings our backend. But currently right now, we're not at the point where we're discussing all of the cross-site origins and all that good stuff because that's getting really in-depth. So I want to make sure we're utilizing Postman for now, just to test out strictly our API use.
Okay.
All right, and then I see, Roger, essentially all we are doing are creating file paths and displaying stuff in these specific locations. Right, we're saying how to respond to a specific path. I see Postman is way easier. Postman is really easy. And then I see something that Bennett sent, and I think he's just sending like the order of operations from things. So the front end sends in an HTTP request. The HTTP request then gets handled by Django's URL. Those URLs then trigger a view. Those views can query the database or may not query the database depending on the behavior that you want. And then after that, that gets sent back to HTTP, which then gets sent to the front end. Okay. Any other questions?
So that string of events that Jesse was talking through, is that how it's always going to go? Is it always going to go from project to app to views, or are we going to sometimes not use a view controller, or is that always part of it? Like, how does that go?
Yes, it's always going to go in that order. A path cannot exist unless it has a view attached to it or a different place to look at. So if we look at our project, right, our project URLs, I have these paths, but this path has a class and it knows its behavior that it's supposed to do. This path has a specific URL pattern, and then I'm telling it, hey, this is the functionality that I want you to do. I want you to go look somewhere else. Okay, so then it goes and it looks inside of this path. And now this path, although it's an empty string, we know it's prefaced by the earlier URL. And then it only works if this exists. If I take this off, we're going to see that my Django is going to freak out. It's going to say, hey, I have no idea what, like, it's great that you specified a path, but I have no clue what to do with it because there's no view there, right? We can see that it's missing the positional argument for view. So now if I bring back the view, Django will say, oh, okay, well, that's what you want me to do. Now I can function properly because I know how to handle this specific URL path. Does that answer your question, Michael?
Yes, thank you.
Francisco, that as view method, I'm looking at the old Pokemon class, and obviously the only thing we have there is def get. What is that as view method?
Yeah, so we specified a class, right? And when Django was first developed, it only functioned with function-based views, right? So it was only able to recognize functions here on line 7 inside of paths. So although that's great, it ends up doing a lot of repeated code. A lot of different functions have to be created, and we've already seen the benefits of class in multiple different ways. All right, so Django REST frameworks and developers overall wanted to have classes be able to work here. So Django added this feature called asView, so it can grab a class and then treat that class as a view. Because if I take off this asView, I believe Django will freak out on me. All right, so it's telling me, hey, you have this URL pattern, you're specifying a class, but I have no idea what to do with this class. Is there something that you want me to do? Well, now it even tells me, hey, add as view if you want me to treat this class as a view. So I'm going to go ahead and add as view, and then Django will compile correctly and actually return to me a functional URL.
Yeah, thank you,
Ivan. Okay,
perfect. Yeah, yes, thank you.
What can we see in the browser, and why is that an empty string? Okay, so I'll go over the empty string question first, and actually I just hit the timer, so please go ahead and take a 10-minute break if you would like. Everyone, please be back by 10:20. But if you have questions, stick around. All right, so this URL pattern is coming from here, from 21. It's saying API v1 Pokemon, right? And then I tell it to include whatever's left over inside of my app. So now I go in my URLs and we see this empty string. Well, it's saying that, well, let me look at Postman here. Oh, that ain't Postman. This is all I'm pinging, right? If I had anything following on there, like a 1, and I send this GET request, it's going to send an error because it's saying, well, I have no idea how to handle this. If I had a path, and I'm just going to comment this out so it doesn't get in the way. If I had a path that said, okay, well, now I also want you to handle if it says 1, and I want you to say hello, per se, right? And then I sent that request, it would work because it would just patch that 1 to the very end of the URL that I had in my project, all right? But currently I don't have anything following on, so I have to send an empty, I have to set an empty pattern here on line 7 so that it knows that all it needs to function or to trigger that view is receive this URL pattern. Does that answer your question there, Nick?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Of course. Okay, so what can we see in the browser? And actually, I'm not sure. Let's check out the browser. Let's send a GET request. Okay, there you go. We see a black screen with GET true. Okay.
So why does it say to get true again?
Yeah, so it's saying get true because that's the JSON response that I'm returning. So if I go to my views, I'm returning
Oh, I see.
on response of get true. Draw these pathways connections on the Scholar Draw today. I think visualizing the path would be very helpful. Yeah, we definitely can. I'm gonna wait until the whole class comes back to do that, but that's a good call. Thank you so much, Jake.
Yeah, I will second that. That's like I'm a visual learner, probably just like Jake, and like all there's so many files that are talking to each other in chain events. Yeah, that would be incredible.
Yeah, of course.
I got a quick question. Inside your views, PY, why are you, well, in the lesson on the GitHub, you got from .models import Pokemon, but the lesson also has you bring in from moves underscore app .models import move. Why is one using .models for import and the other one's using the move .app models for import?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I will definitely clarify it as well later on. But just to answer your question, that dot is saying from this specific directory. So the directory that I'm currently on, which is Pokemon app, right? This file is inside of Pokemon app. I want you to grab the models file inside of Pokemon app and import Pokemon from that, right? But when I import move doesn't live inside of this directory. So I have to specify from the move app directory.
If you did put a Pokemon underscore app in front of that models there, would that affect it at all, or would it still find it?
No, I would still be able to find it. So I could say Pokemon
Yeah,
underscore app.
gotcha. All right, cool. And I think it was brought up earlier too, the from rest underscore framework dot views. I think some people are still getting squiggly lines. I'm still seeing that too. You said that was a VS Code issue?
It is, yeah. So it's a workbench issue. So you guys, I can definitely, let me clarify it right now real quick for whoever's here. So for whoever's here, if you do Command Shift P or Control Shift P and then go into settings, you'll see this work settings, but you want the JSON one. So let me take a look here. Okay, so open workspace settings in JSON. And then in here, you're gonna want to specify your specific Python path, which I have in a different project. So let me grab that for everyone so everyone can utilize it. So this is an example. So please don't use the same exact one. You'll have to replace the path for your own. And I'm sending it here in the uniform channel.
Thanks.
Of course.
Should it still work without updating those settings? Is this just for like the IntelliSense?
Yeah, this will still work without updating the settings. The only reason why it's freaking out is because VS Code just acts dumb sometimes and it can't recognize what's being installed into the virtual environment.
Okay, so doing what you just said will only just get rid of the squiggly lines, but it won't change like what the outcome is.
Right. Everything will still function correctly. It's just for making it look nice.
Okay, thanks.
Of course. And I totally forgot to pause the recording, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that now. As soon as I find the Zoom bar, there you are. All right, welcome back, everyone. So far, we've been talking about how everything connects, and we saw a couple of demonstrations happening through Django, but maybe just looking at code isn't the best way to demonstrate this at this point. As a student previously mentioned, it would be greatly appreciated to see us drawn out. So we're going to go ahead and take some time to draw this out. Maybe we should take a look at it. I know we requested a Scala draw, but unfortunately Scala draw isn't my strong suit. So I'm going to go ahead and go to TL draw. And I apologize to everyone if they prefer Scala draw over this, but if I spend some time messing around with buttons on Scala draw, I'm just going to waste your guys' time. So I don't want to do that. Let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of things here. So we want to start off with talking about the client, right? So let's go ahead and a couple of boxes here. Maybe this one says client. Oh, hello. Just gonna make a couple of different ones. And then we'll move from there. Okay, so clients messing around with their site or the site that we created, the front end site, and they send a request. Well, once they send that request, we know that that request then needs to go to the server, which is Django. All right, so that request then goes to the Django server. Once it hits the Django server, well, the Django server is also what in itself? What is it that's creating our Django server? Well, it's our Django project, right? Our server can exist, and it only exists because of our Django project. So it goes into the Django project, and then it goes into the minute details, right? And actually, let me grab these and move them to a different spot over here. Okay, so it sends the client sends a request, and that request then goes to the server. Well, then the server, once it hits Django, it says, well, how am I supposed to handle this? And let's take a look at what this specific portion is doing so far before I even start moving into that. Okay, so what does this request look like? Well, let's grab some text here. Let's add it there. So in this request, I wanted to go to HTTP // it goes to the name of domain, which in our case is our local host. And then after that, it goes to API/v1/Pokemon. Okay, so that's what our request looks like, right? So client sends the request and it sends it here and it pings the Django server. Well, now Django server needs to figure out how is it supposed to handle this request. So the Django server then goes ahead and pings the urls.py at the project level. And basically asks the urls.py at the project level, what am I supposed to do with this? Well, at the project level, we don't have many of our view controllers or handlers or any of that. So it needs to go to an app. So then at the project, I'm just simply going to connect it to the app. So now I'm going to say app urls.py. Okay, so client sends the request, it gets to Django. Django says, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do with this. And asks the urls.py, says, hey, are you tracking that this specific URL pattern even exists? And if it does, it says, yeah, it does actually. And I'm going to connect you with this other URLs that lives inside of the app. Okay, so now it goes into the app. And inside of the app, we have this pattern. And we also have a function or a view controller, the view and how it's supposed to respond to this. Okay, so now it says, what am I supposed to do with this? Hey, I'm tracking this URL pattern does exist, and I have a view. And this view, I'm going to go ahead and ping the view to say, okay, well, I'm tracking, I have a view, but what is it that this view is supposed to do? What is it that you want me to do? What's the behavior? What's the outcome? Okay, so it goes to the view, and then it specifies inside of the view what method is it that we're using. We've already talked about this, right? We have the different methods inside of the class, and in this case, we're specifically going over the get method. Well, in the example that I provided to all of you, our database is included. So the view knows, hey, I'm supposed to send a request or a query to the database. And this query is going to be select all from Pokemon, because that's what this individual wants to see. So that goes into the database. The database runs this query and then returns the answer back to the view. And then when it returns it to the view, we know that it returns it in a class format. So it returns a query set of a list of class of Pokemon classes. Okay. So it sends we send the request. Django server says, hey, do we have this URL pattern? What am I supposed to do with this? So it asks the URLs. URL says we do have this URL pattern and it's connected to this app. So then it goes to the app and says, hey, this is the URL that I have. Do you have anything else on this? And then the app says, yeah, I know what I'm supposed to do for this. I have a view that's supposed to handle this. So it says, hey, view, I got a request for this specific pattern. What is it that you're supposed to do? And it's a get request. And the view says, well, I'm going to ping the database and I'm going to grab all the Pokemon. So it pings the database, grabs all the Pokemon. And after it grabs all the Pokemon, well, now it sends back a response to that URL pattern. And then that response, and I'm just going to make this yellow. Okay, well then that response then gets sent to that URL pattern, which then says, hey, project, I know this is the response for that. Okay, and then the project sends it back to this to the server, which that's kind of redundant to say, but this is just for demonstrational purposes. And then after all of this is done, well, now the server says, all right, well, now I got all the information that I need, and I know what to do with it, and it returns it back to the client. And that's basically how this functionality is working. We're sending the request, it's going to the server's then basically connecting the dots, going to the project, connecting that path to the app path, and then having the app handle the view so that it can return the correct information that I need. And then I'm going to send all that information all the way back to the client. I hope that was helpful. At this point, does anyone have any questions over what I just covered?
Francisco, so the path function is what traces or accesses it from the project URLs to app URLs and then to view, right?
The path, yes, the path function within the project URLs, correct.
Okay.
I had a quick question, kind of branching off of what Kelvin said with would it be possible to only use one URL.py? I understand why we wouldn't use that for one app, but for all things we're wanting a specific app to do, we're including all that within the same path that we posted within our project URL.
Right. So I get what you guys, I get what we're asking, and I will definitely answer that question later on once we go into handling different paths and why we would want to outsource to a specific app URL file.
Okay.
So the as view method in the URLs.py that triggers the views.py in that same folder.
So the as view method, which is attached to the class, this is what you're referencing to, right? This as view method is telling this path that this class should be treated as a view controller. That it's not just a general class that exists somewhere in my code. It's a class that is strictly to be treated as a view controller. Does that answer your question, Pete?
Yeah, I think so. I'm still kind of having a hard time understanding that.
Okay. Let's see.
Where's all Pokemon coming from?
Yeah, so all Pokemon is coming from my views file.
Oh, okay. Yep, that makes sense now.
Okay, perfect. What was the syntax to add a move into a Pokemon? Okay. That was answered. All right. Any other questions?
What does the API view do?
One more time.
Do you have to import that to your views.py?
Yeah. So this API view, that's what you're asking for?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is coming from Django REST frameworks. And Django REST frameworks is basically doing a lot of functionality in the backend so that we don't have to do it ourselves. And one of those functionality is treating request. So it's specifically filtering out the request. And that way it knows that the only things that we're supposed to receive are whatever I specify. So if I go over to Postman, right, and I were to send a post request, once I send it, I get a Django error. And instead of getting a bunch of lines of, hey, I have no idea what to do with this, it just says, hey, oh, that was the wrong URL pattern. Let me go ahead and send that again. And instead of getting a whole error where it just says, I have no idea what to do, you didn't specify how to handle this, it tells me specifically, hey, this method's not allowed. Just because of the fact that I didn't define it, it's strictly telling my server that this method's not allowed. If I wasn't utilizing Django REST frameworks to handle requests and responses, then it would I would have to specify myself with a particular hefty lines of code that this method would not be allowed. Does that make sense? Okay, I see the head nods. Perfect.
Yep.
Okay, I see something else in the chat. Thank you. I appreciate the artist shout out. All right. Let's go ahead and keep moving forward here then. All right, so now we saw this query set and we know that it's working correctly because when I go ahead and go into Postman and I send my GET request, I'm getting my response. But currently I want my response to return all of my Pokemon, right? Not only do I want it to return all of my Pokemon, but I also want to see it return all of the moves that this Pokemon knows. Well, let's check this out. I was able to print all Pokemon. So I wonder what happens if I just return all Pokemon. Let's see what Django does when I send this. Okay, so I obviously got an error. And it's saying, hey, you can't do this. And the main reason why I can't do this is because all Pokemon. Oh, okay. Well, right now it's saying this is a list of things. So let's go ahead and give it a key. Oh, probably want to close off that quotation mark. All right, so now I give it a key and now it's a JSON value, right? As a key pair value, the key being Pokemon and the value being the list of all the Pokemon. So now again, let's send that request. Still gives me an error. And now it's giving me an error because it's saying object of type query set is not JSON serializer. Okay, so let's Command Z here a little bit. Go back to what we had. Let's ping our API one more time. So now that it's working, I'm getting true. We see that I'm getting this query set here, right? So it means that although this is a list of different Pokemons, the data type here is a query set. Now there's a couple of different ways that I can grab all those values and actually make them JSON serializable. But there's a specific correct way to do this, right? And the correct way to do this is that we're going to utilize a tool provided to us by Django. And it's coming from serializers. So I'm going to go into django.core.serializers and I'm going to import serialize. Okay. So now, what is it that serialize is doing? Well, I'm grabbing all this information from my database. So there's probably a way that I would want to turn all of this information from the database into something that I can work with. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's grab all of my Pokemon. Or actually, let's do some variable real. Let's say serialized Pokemon. I wish there was like a GUI for all these dang inputs. I'm not sure what GUI means, but if you're asking for something, let me know what it is and I'll make sure I provide it. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and serialize this. And serialize takes a couple of different arguments. So if I hover over it, it's going to tell me, well, what format is it that you want me to serialize this to? And what query set, because it's looking for a query set, and it's telling me specifically this needs to be a iterable model. So it needs to be a list of models inside of there. So I want it to return to me a JSON format. And what I wanted to work with is all Pokemon. Well, now let's print serialized Pokemon. And let's also print all Pokemon so that we can see both of them, how they work, and what is it that they're offering to us. Okay, so I go ahead and I send this request. Everything came back successfully. And if I come back over here, okay, so we see that first print statement. It just prints this query set that has the individual instances, and it's triggering my string method that I gave to each one of those instances, right? Well, now let's look at the serialized version. We can see that in the serialized version, not only is it returning the name of the instance, it's returning to me which model specifically it is that it came from. We can see that it can specify what app it's coming from. It specifies the primary key. And it goes over into the fields. And in the fields, it's telling me, well, hey, I have this name, I have the level, pretty much all the information that's coming from that's coming straight out of my database is getting placed into this serialized response. Okay, well, now that it's serialized, I know that I can now work with it and return it. So for now, let's just return this part and then we'll work into the next portion. So currently right now we're working with JSON response. And we saw that JSON response only functions if we have those curly brackets towards the end. Well, luckily enough for us, REST framework thought about that. And it's created this response ability so that we can send back different types of responses without them having to be in a JSON format. So now I can send back anything. I can send back just a string that says anything. I can send back a list. I can send back Boolean variables, and Django REST framework will be able to handle that on its own and specify which type of response is it that I want to return. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and return my serialized Pokemon. All right, so now I have the serialized Pokemon as my response. Let's see what that looks like in Postman. Go into Postman, I ping my API, and it returns a serialized response. But there's a very important thing that we have to remember here. I told it to interpret it as JSON, right? So because I told it to interpret it as JSON, we can see that this is all in one line, and it's just one massive string, right? So that's not necessarily what we want. So let's fix that. We've worked with JSON before. So what kind of Python library can I use to basically turn this JSON into readable Python code?
Parse.
Say again?
JSON.parse?
Yeah, so let's bring in JSON. Let's import JSON. And let's say workable Pokemon. And let's make that equal to JSON. And we're going to load this JSON object. And we'll pass in serialized Pokemon. And then for a response, we'll return workable. Okay, so finally, when I ping it, now we'll see some actual readable code that I can utilize in my front end. Right, and I have a list. So when I go into my front end, I can make a for loop and then have a specific behavior that I want to create. So if I had something like images in here, right, maybe I can make a for loop, and for every single dictionary or object inside of this list or array, if I'm working in the front end, I can grab that specific URL and have it render on my page. All right, so now I'm grabbing this, and this is all working great. And I like the way it looks, but if we can take a look here, we see that moves. It's just giving me the ID. And that's not necessarily something that I want, right? I don't just want to see the IDs. I actually want to see the value of each one of those moves. Okay, so let's go ahead and fix that. Because I wanted to interact with moves, I'm going to have to import moves into this app. So I'm going to say from move app.models, and I'm going to import move. And so everyone is tracking, right? This is just this is how we're importing different things into Django. And this is working from Python. So by saying from move app, what I'm telling it to do is I want it to go to the move app folder or directory, look inside of the models file, and import the class of move. Here in line 2, what I'm saying is in this directory, grab the models file and import the Pokemon class that lives inside that models file. Okay. All right, so now that I have this move, let's go ahead and take a look at what we can do here. I have these fields, and from what I'm able to see here, inside of fields, there is a key called moves that has my ID. Well, now let's go ahead and grab that. So I'm going to create or let's just do it here first. So let's say moves, right? And what I want to do is a list of moves. And I'm going to set that equal to workable Pokemon. I want to go into the fields. And then I want to grab moves. And that's going to return to me this list that I have under moves. Okay, well now for each one of those, all right, now I want to make sure that I say fields. I missed.
Field is misspelled.
Thank you so much. All right. So I'm basically iterating through that dictionary to grab the moves. And now I can go ahead and grab each individual move from my database. When I can say for move in list of moves, I want you to make my move variable. So my move is equal to, and in this case, I'm going to say move dot objects dot get, where the ID is equal to move, because we know it's a list of numbers. And this is essentially saying select all from move where ID is equal to I guess whatever it is that move is representing, right? So let's just say 1 in this case, but we know that as it iterates, it will have a different value. Okay, so now I grabs my moves, and I basically want to repeat this entire process to turn it into something that's JSON readable. So I'm just going to use some variable reassignment here. And actually, that might be confusable, so I'm just going to say workable move. And that's going to be equal to JSON.loads. I'm going to serialize this information by turning it into a JSON object and then passing in my move. Now, something that I want to clarify. Remember, serialize is looking for something that's iterable, a list of query sets. And currently here on line 20, I only have 1 instance. So because it's 1 instance, it's not iterable. So I'm just going to simply say, hey, this is a list with 1 specific value inside of it. That way it can actually iterate through it and serialize it. Okay, so now after I've done all of that, when I can go ahead and reassign my list of moves. So let's say workable list of moves. And now what I want to do is after I do this, I'm just going to say workable list of moves dot append. And then I'll go ahead and append that workable move. And now finally, what I can say is go into my workable Pokemon, go into its fields, go into the moves, and set that equal to my workable list of moves. Okay, so that was a whole hassle. Now let's go ahead and take a look at what exactly it is that it did. Well, now when I send this request, okay, well, it failed. So let's take a look at what I did here. Apparently I misspelled fields. Oh, list indices can't take an integer. Okay, perfect. List of moves. Oh, so I'll even have to iterate through all of my Pokemon. So let's do that. For Pokemon and workable Pokemon. And I'm going to go ahead and indent this. And then say current Pokemon dense. Okay. Yeah, I'll definitely break this down right after. I apologize. I might have just taken off. So I'm just gonna say current Pokemon is equal to workable Pokemon at index Pokemon. Okay, and now anywhere where workable Pokemon is located, I want to make sure that I change it. Oh, I only want to change these two apparently. And what I want to change those for is current Pokemon. Okay, send the request. It still fails. I must have done something else that was wrong. List indices must be integers, of course, because I don't know how to write Python code. So we're gonna do range and len. Close that. Oh. Okay, now we finally got the end result that we want. All right, so let's go over what we just did. We grabbed all of our Pokemon strictly from our query set. We serialize it. Because we serialize.
Okay, I found this on the web for We Serializer. Check it out.
Okay, that's done.
Ooh, what you got? What you got?
All right. Now that we went ahead and serialized it, we had a JSON string. But because we had a JSON string, we couldn't do anything to it. That's definitely not the end state, Christopher. We want to make sure that people understand what's going on. Yeah. So now we want to make sure that we load that information so that it's Python readable code. And that's what I did here, right? I said JSON.loads. I grabbed that serialized string and I turned it into Python code. Okay, so finally I have a list. I hope you guys are just giving me crud in the chat, and that's not how you guys genuinely feel. But we'll see. So now we're gonna go ahead and iterate through that.
How does JSON.loads work? It just converts from Python to JSON?
Yeah, so JSON.loads basically takes JSON string and then turns it into Python code. Because Python doesn't really have a way to work with JSON, right? JSON works well and integrates well with JavaScript, but not with Python. So that's why we have to utilize the .loads.
Have we used that method before?
I believe so. And if we haven't, this is okay. So it looks, I see a couple of people saying no. So maybe it was my wrong assessment and we haven't done this. Okay. So yeah, JSON.loads is gonna go ahead and take that string of JSON and turn it into Python code. After we have Python code, we have a list of different Pokemon. We're going to iterate through them by the index, grab each Pokemon by index, and then alter its moves. And we have a whole nested move for it, which is why this function got so big, all right? And technically what we did was we queried the database for every single one of these moves. Okay, at this point, does anyone have any questions? And I know there is, so please make sure that you ask the questions over what we just covered as far as being able to get all of my Pokemon, serialize the query set that comes back from the database, turn it into Python readable code, and then change the individual fields within that response.
I think I'm just gonna need some like hands-on doing this myself to really get a full grip on it, honestly.
Yeah, I fully agree. Okay, it seems like everyone's just ready for some group work, and I'm sure everyone's also tired of my voice, and maybe we want to stop seeing me do some code. So let me go ahead and pause the recording, and then we'll break off into groups, and we can tackle the next part of the school assignment API.
Could I ask you a
I got
question? real quick?
yeah, I got one too when you're done, Ethan.
So walking through that code where you iterate through the list of moves, the my move dot objects, that's getting the exact move, and then workable move. When we're serializing that, since I remember you talking about it, I was kind of like trying to keep up with you, so I kind of slipped. But you put those brackets around the my move, and that makes it iterable
Correct, because it's looking for something that's iterable.
because it's originally not iterable.
Right, because it's only returning one object from the database because we're getting something by ID. And since IDs are unique, it only returns one. And get is only supposed to return one object overall. So that's why I need to make sure that it's wrapped inside of the list.
Okay, so that list is just saying it's still one object within the list, but it's just iterable because it's in a list.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
For
Now-
the postman, was there something you had to do to be able to send those requests? So mine's saying requests cannot be sent in public workspaces right now. It says you have to fork this collection for that to work. And when I try to fork it, it gives me a sync error.
Yeah, no, all I did was install Postman, and then after that, once it lives inside of your local machine, you should be able to just send requests strictly there. If it's not working that way, we need to meet up after this and see what's
Okay. No, that's doing something else. So after this,
okay. Perfect. All right, and then gonna have to remove Django from my res. Don't say that. Okay, let me go ahead and pause the recording at this point. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Let's go ahead and continue on with our lesson for the day. So before we took off, we were actually able to build an application that was able to get pinged by Postman or just the web overall and get a specific result. And I apologize, everyone. It seems like I have another server running somewhere. Found it. All right. So now that I have this running with Postman, I'm able to go ahead and click this send to send a GET request and get a massive error here because I'm sending it to the wrong project. So instead of classes, I want this to be Pokemon. Okay, so now I send it and I'm able to see my Pokemon fields along with their moves. Okay, so that's the stuff that we covered before we left. Let's go ahead and take a look at what else we can there is to know about endpoints. Well, currently endpoints, we have this specific endpoint and we're telling that to end at API v1 Pokemon. And earlier today, when we practiced the school exercise 5, we saw that there's such a thing as a name variable, or we were getting an error because we weren't providing a name variable. So let's take a look here. If I click on path, I can see the path is asking for something called a route pattern. And this might be going a little too in depth, but we can see here that it's asking for the route, and that's the very first argument that we pass in there. After that, it's asking for the function. And then lastly, it needs this self.name. It needs to know what is the name of this endpoint. Okay, so if I hover over path, it tells me, hey, these are the things that you can pass into me. You can give me a route, you could give me a view, and you could give me a name. So finally, I can specify name, and I can say this is all Pokemon. And we'll see why this is useful later on once we get into testing. But know that if you are planning on writing tests for your URL patterns, you need to ensure that every path has a name. And this doesn't necessarily have to correlate with anything. This is just whatever you want to call it. You're essentially just establishing a reference that you can utilize for Django to be able to recognize this path. All right. So now let's go into endpoints and what they are doing here. Let me close that. We went over getting all of the Pokemon. Well, what if I wanted to get one specific Pokemon? What would that look like now? Well, let's think about it. Currently, right now, this DEF cat grabs all the Pokemon because it queries all of my Pokemon. Well, maybe I need to create an instance where I can grab one specific Pokemon. And we've been doing it a couple of times. We can see here that we're doing it again, where I'm asking it to assert the ID, right? And if the ID is equal to, then we can return that Pokemon. But now I'm wondering, how is it that my user can now give me this information? So let's take a look at the Poke API here. Oh no, where's the browser? Let me see. Okay, browser ran away on me. I'm gonna have to open up a new one here real quick. Yeah, and let's go to the Poke API. So here in the Poke API, we see that they're working on an API. They're on version 2. And then they have the same Pokemon endpoint that we have, all right? But then after that, we can see that they have a parameter, essentially, of different Pokemon that I can look for. If I look for Ditto, it gives me back Ditto's information. If I look for Pikachu, oh, if I could spell, it would give me back Pikachu's information, and so on. So if I try to recreate this, what would that look like, right? I need to establish a way for my API or my URL handlers to be able to treat this argument, grab it, and conduct some type of logic with it. But let's say we want to grab everything by name. Now we want to do it exactly how the Poke API is working. Well, let's go over to URL patterns. So currently, if I go to my project URLs, it's saying that at this endpoint, which is what I want, to include Pokemon app.urls. So that's pretty much the same thing that we see in the Poke API, right? We see the Poke API, we see V2, and then Pokemon. Okay, so that's what I have as well. And then after that, I'm telling it to include my Pokemon app.urls. So let's go into Pokemon app.urls. And we see that we just have an empty path. So I wonder what happens if I ping the empty path here. So if I ping an empty path, we see that it returns a count of 1,281 Pokemon. That's a lot of Pokemon. And if we click on results, it basically returns to me a list of all of the Pokemon. Currently, it only displays 20 of them, but this list would continue going on for all of the Pokemon that exist inside of this API. So we already went over this behavior. But again, now the next part that I want to go over is looking over a specific Pokemon. Well, Django knows that if we try to build an API, we want to be able to pass parameters or give the client the ability to pass parameters to us. So we're going to go ahead and place a comma here. We're going to start a new path here. Okay, and let me go to URL projects. And I'm going to grab this so that we can visualize it. So all URL patterns that's included in here are going to be prefaced, or this is only adding on to this already established URL pattern in our project. All right. So now what I want to do is I want Django to account for a Pokemon's name. And there's a couple of different URL patterns that Django is actually able to handle. And specifically by couple, I mean 2. It's able to handle integers and it's able to handle string. So I'm going to go ahead, and in this case, I'm going to tell it that I want to receive a string. So I'm going to say str, and I'm going to tell it that it's going to handle the Pokemon name. And then I'm going to close it. So it is a specific syntax, right? I'm putting it inside of these arrow brackets, kind of like an HTML element. I'm specifying what type, which is string. And then I'm specifying what it is that I'm going to call this variable. Okay. So now that I build out the route for it, we need the actual view. So let's go take a look at our views file and see what we can do there. So currently I have this get all Pokemon or all Pokemon, but now I want to create something where it would only be handling a Pokemon. So let's go ahead and fix that. So I'm going to call it class, and to make it explicit, I'll name it single Pokemon. Same thing as before, it's going to take in an API view. And then I'm going to go ahead and establish my get method. So myself, it's equal to request. And for now, we'll just return a response of true. Just to get it working. So I established a single Pokemon, and now I'm going to connect it to that URL pattern. So now I go over to my Pokemon app URLs, and I import single Pokemon. Okay, well, Django's giving me a problem. It's saying, hey, you have a path, but it's missing one positional argument. I'm looking for a view, but I see that it doesn't exist. And it's telling me that this is happening at line 8 of my URLs of Pokemon app. So here on line 8. So how do I fix that? Does anyone have any ideas?
You add the method, single Pokemon.
Yeah, so I have to put in there the class, and I have to specify that it needs to treat this as a view. And then I'm also going to give it a name, and I'm going to say single Pokemon. Okay, so now it's registering everything. This is great. So now essentially what I've built is I've built a URL that can handle input that specifies something like Pikachu. That's what this URL pattern is doing. Okay. Well, that's the same thing I created over here. Now I have it there. And how exactly is that going to look like in my view controllers? Well, let's check it out, right? Because we connected the argument, but currently right now, I don't know if I have any access into it. So let's go ahead and say I put in Pikachu in there. And I close it with a slash. I send this request. Well, this request is freaking out. It's telling me, hey, I have no idea what it is you're doing. Let me take a look here to make sure it's working correctly. So got an unexpected keyword argument, Pokemon name. Okay. So it's saying it doesn't know how to handle this. It's saying, where is Pokemon name? I have no idea what I'm supposed to do with this. You're passing too many arguments. That's what it means here. I got an unexpected argument. So if I take a look inside of my get method, currently I have self, I have request. Well, maybe in here I can say name from request. Okay, now let's go look a bit back at Postman. Let's send this request one more time. Okay, I still got an error. And it seems it continues to get an unexpected keyword. I wonder where this error is coming from now, because that shouldn't be happening. Let me make sure here. Yeah, it's coming in single Pokemon. Let me make sure one more time. So string Pokemon name. Okay, so you're getting a not found error. That's not good. But mine is getting an unexpected argument. Pokemon name. Oh, I apologize. I totally messed that up. So it's looking for Pokemon name. So whatever it is that I name it here on line 9, it's the same thing that I have to name it within my view. So here I have name from request. Well, it's freaking out because it says I don't know what name from request is. Go ahead and click it. Now we get back true, which is what I expected. But we can see request here and we see Pokemon name. But what exactly is it that Pokemon name has got to do? Well, let's check out what we're receiving. Let's print out Pokemon name. Okay. And now it's going to print it out in my terminal after I send my request. So again, let's send the request. And now we can see in my terminal that I'm getting Pikachu. Okay, so just to recap, this is what we've done thus far. We wanted to make sure that our API that we're creating works somewhat like the Poke API. We have already established a route that's API version 2 or version 1 that then takes in an argument of Pokemon. And then after the slash, you can pass in a string parameter. So now I identified that and I wanted to adjust my routes to be able to do that. So I went over to my project to make sure that I was still resembling everything correctly. It looks exactly like the Poke API, that's what I expect. And now here, I made this note so that I know all of my URL patterns are prepended by API, V1, and Pokemon. Well, at that empty path, I'm returning all of the Pokemon. But if I specify a string parameter, it should just return that one Pokemon. And I specify here, hey, this is going to be a string, or this argument is going to be a type string. And this is the variable that you'll find in this argument as. And when I went over to my views, I created a single Pokemon API view that upon a GET request, it looks for that specific Pokemon name. Okay, questions at this point before we keep moving forward?
So what's the point of the single Pokemon name in the other file if you're not referencing it here? Or where would we reference that?
Single Pokemon name. Where?
In the URLs.
Okay.
Yeah, the name single Pokemon there. We haven't referenced that yet, have we?
We haven't touched that yet. No.
What are we gonna use that for? Okay.
Did you have something in your project URL files?
So go. What do you mean by something?
Oh, okay, no, it's just same thing. Okay.
Okay.
All right, the as view part again. What exactly is happening with the as view?
Yeah, so the ask view, without us passing that ask view method into this class, Django won't know what to do with this class. By me passing in ask view, it's saying, hey, this is a class. I know you're expecting a function, but I want you to treat this class as a view handler.
Thanks.
Of course.
So is it putting the Pokemon name as an argument? Is that what it's doing?
Yeah, so this is giving us an argument of Pokemon name that we can then utilize in our view. Pokemon name.
And that other name is just the name of that path, correct?
You're talking about this one right here, right?
Correct.
Yes, that's just the name. Okay, let's keep.
Hey, Francisco, one question real fast. For the name convention for that, the one before this from our project, the API/V1, is that because we're trying to replicate what the Pokemon API is, or is that going to be standard practice that we should use API in that in our APIs?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You should always use API/ and then the version of whatever the API is that you're working on. This is just a standard practice for building an API overall. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Of course.
Response, real quick. Just that next page, the response.
The page response.
No, yeah, sorry, that's all I was looking at. Response true. We have to put that specifically, or why would we have to put that necessarily?
So if we don't put a response and we try to ping our API is going to freak out saying, well, hey, I was expecting this to return some sort of response, but currently this view handler isn't returning anything as a response. And Django even tells me, hey, I expected a response of any one of these types, but I didn't get a response from this view handler at all. So that's why we have to give it something to return.
Thanks.
Can it be anything, or is it? Or,
yeah,
it
could be anything for now. But later on, we would want it to match whatever it is that we expect our API to return. Okay.
Sorry, one last question.
Yeah.
So like when we build a project here coming up, are we gonna, or would it make sense if like our project had an API that pinged our own database, but we also use an API to ping other databases for other data as well?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And yeah, definitely you will have to utilize other APIs in your project. All right. So for example, let's say you build some sort of stock application. Why would you try to build all the stocks and WebSockets that you need to make to keep a live feed of how those are being changed every millisecond when you could ping an API to get that information? All right. And we'll go over how to integrate a third-party API into our backend tomorrow, actually.
So for a project like that, would you end up building a database at all? Like maybe just if you had like a account, I guess, to sign in on the website and view everything? Would that be like a practical application of your own database you keep up with and ping with an API?
Yeah, that would be a pretty good one if you just want to have your way of keeping track of users. If it's an actual application that you want to grow and foster, maybe you want to put some type of data capture and you want to create your own data table to figure out how many times a user presses a button or how long a user stays on a specific screen. All those things could be later on developed inside of your own specific database, so you have that information.
Thank you.
Of course. All right. So now that I have this Pokemon name, that's great and all, but how do I return one specific Pokemon? Well, so far we've been doing these methods of querying the database, but we haven't really covered them in much in depth. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So there's a couple of typical ones that we'll see. We'll see get, we will see all, we'll see filter, and finally, well, one of my favorite ones is order by. Okay, so now let's talk about them. There's a lot more, and you guys could definitely look at the Django documentation to read a lot more about them, but it wouldn't be feasible for me to cover every single type of different way to query the database right now. But for this get method, right, this get method expects to return only one instance from the database. And it's equivalent, or actually, yeah, it just expects to return one instance. All right, now this expects to return all instances as a list. This will return a list of instances where, or that meet the stated condition. And then order by could go at the end of any of these, and we could specify how we would like to order it. So equivalent to sort. Okay. So now that I know a little bit more about these methods, which one of these methods is that I would want to use to return one specific Pokemon?
I'm gonna take a random guess here, but I'm gonna say get.
Yeah, so we're gonna use get. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna say, okay, well now I know I want to grab a Pokemon. And I'm gonna make that equal to the model Pokemon dot objects dot get. And we know we're receiving the name. So let's take a look at the model. The model's taking in a specific name here. So now let's go to our views. What argument would I pass here inside of this get clause? What would go in there?
Would be the Pokemon dot name.
Yeah, we would want where, as we saw earlier, when we pass the get function, we're saying where ID is equal to the move, right? Well, now what I would want is where name is equal to Pokemon name. And this is essentially saying select all from Pokemon where name equals Pikachu. Or whatever it is that's passed through the parameter.
This wouldn't work if you didn't do name equals Pokemon name. Like if you just passed it Pokemon name, it wouldn't work.
Oh, if I just passed the Pokemon name? No, because then it wouldn't know where to run this where clause. It wouldn't know if it's running it against an ID, if it's running it against the description. You have to specify what it is to check and then what to check for.
Okay.
Okay, so now let's go ahead and print this Pokemon. And we know we have a dunder method, so we should be able to see that dunder method get triggered. We just send our request. Okay, so we see that first print statement that's printing out the argument that we received through the URL pattern. It's Pokemon name. And then we go ahead and query the database to grab one specific Pokemon instance. And when we print that Pokemon, we see Pikachu has been captured. And just like that, I was able to query the database and apply my users' feedback. So let's see what else we got here. Let's say I think the other ones that I have is Charizard and Blastoids. I'm not sure, but I'm going to go with that. Okay, yes, I do have a Charizard, and now we can see Charizard has been captured. Right, and it's all because it's querying the database, and when it runs it against the database, it's saying select all from Pokemon where name is equal to, and then I think it needs quotation marks, Charizard. Okay, so it doesn't need quotation. Messing this up, aren't I?
Is that single quotes?
I think SQL only takes single quotes.
I don't think that's the problem. I think it's looking for. Oh, yeah, it is single quotes. Thank you so much. Yeah, so now it's able to identify the ID, bring me back Charizard, take the time and the dig encountered and all that good stuff. Okay, so now I'm able to query my database and grab some information. If you don't have the Pokemon built, it's going to return a 404 not found, Della. Okay. So now let's go ahead and keep moving forward here. Once I return this Pokemon, I know that I have this thing for being able to serialize a Pokemon. So maybe I just want to grab all this information and turn it into a method somewhere. But that might be a little bit out of scope here. Just know that you can grab specific pieces of code, turn it into a method or a function, and then just utilize that within your code so you're not repeating yourself. But for now, we're going to do it here, where I'm going to say Pokemon is equal to JSON.loads. I'm going to serialize this Pokemon. I'm going to turn it into JSON. And I wanted to do that for Pokemon. Well, now I wonder what Pokemon would look like. Go ahead.
Could you explain the serialize a little bit more?
Yeah. Could you go a little bit more in depth as to what it is that you would like me to explain, or just overall the serializer?
Like, what is it doing? So it takes the argument JSON as a string.
Mm-hmm.
And then it just formats it to whatever you pass it into it.
Yeah, so the serializer here, it's asking for a format. And by format, it's saying, well, what format is it that you want this to be returned by? There's a couple of other formats that I could ask for. I don't necessarily know them off the top of my head because I never utilize them. But serialize will essentially take in the first argument being what format is it that you want this in? Because currently it's a query set. And because I can't work with a query set, I need to ensure that it gets changed to a JSON format. But then I need to be able to actually manipulate it. And that's why we need to grab the JSON.loads so that after serialize returns that JSON formatted variable, I can then turn it into some Python code by using JSON.loads. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you very much.
Of course. If you did turn that code into a function, how would you organize it? As in, what folder and file name would you keep the functions? That's a really good question, Kristen. I typically make a utilities file, and then that's where I put any functions that I'm going to utilize anywhere else. And then afterwards, I import them into specific files wherever I'm going to need them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Okay, so now let's keep moving on here. We have this print statement. It's all great. Let's take a look at what that looks like. I go ahead and ping it. It comes back true. And now when I take a look here, we can see that it's returning one specific Pokemon, right? With the same thing of serialized moves. So now I could do this whole gibberish problem over here where I'm gonna iterate through it and then grab one Pokemon and fix all of it. So let's see here. I think this is all I need here. I'm gonna go ahead and copy that. I'm actually gonna make this equal to index 0 because as we can see, it comes back inside of a list. And I don't need it to come back inside of a list anymore. I just need the one dictionary in there. So I'm gonna put index 0 so that it comes back as one dictionary. And then after that, let's take a look at what we have here. Gonna break up that specific stuff. Let's see. So I don't need this either. And I also don't need, oh, I do need this. Okay, so I'm gonna say, hey, this is the list of moves. It's gonna go into Pokemon, right? Which is what I have here. It's gonna go into fields, and it's gonna grab the moves list, which is down here. Okay, after that, I want you to iterate through that move, and I want you to grab each move that's in there. I want you to serialize that move, and then load it through JSON loads. Right after that, I want you to append that to the workable list. And then I'm going to reassign the value of what the fields, the key of fields, and the key of moves are once I go into there. And it's going to be to workable list. Okay. So now finally, I'm going to go ahead and return that Pokemon now that I'm done messing around with it and formatting it in the way that I want it to. I'm going to see what it returns. Okay, so I went ahead and pinged my API. I received my Pokemon. It tells me the primary key. And then finally, I got this Charizard. This Charizard is level 25, all that stuff. And then that for loop was able to return to us moves, which is a list of moves. And it returns to us a specific dictionary holding that individual item. Okay. Just to make sure if I remember correctly, JSON.loads takes JSON text and converts it into Python code. That is correct. Yes, Nick. And then Eric just shared the Django documentation for serializing. So that's great. All right. At this point, are there any questions over what we covered about grabbing one specific instance through user input? Okay, so now comes into the error handling, right? What happens if we use something like, hey, I wanted to return Charizard and I send it all in lowercase? Well, it's going to break because I know that in my front end, in my back end, I have a validator that's saying that no Pokemon will come in with all lowercase letters. It has to start with an uppercase letter. So here in Pokemon.name, what Python function will always make the first index or the first letter of this name? Yep, perfect. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and say title. Okay, so now I go ahead and send this again. And now it works properly because I'm passing in the correct argument. Okay, now let's say I send something ridiculous. that it's not expecting, doesn't know what to do with it. Well, if I send it, it returns all this problem. But the main thing that I care about is this 500. So 500 internal server error. Okay, so this is telling me that my server doesn't know how to handle this. And this is when we start going into try and accept blocks. But I think try and accept blocks are probably a little bit out of scope for this lesson, so we'll save that on for later. Okay. So now we have everything that we need for this specific view. I'm able to get all Pokemon, and I'm able to get a Pokemon. But now it comes to the best part of all programming, which is testing. All right, I'm sure we're all getting pretty fed up dealing with test cases, but it's important for us to know so that when we go out there and we have an interview and they present to us a project and say, hey, I need you to pass these test cases, we're all ready to go because we are already accustomed to having to deal with test cases the entire time we were in this boot camp. So let's go ahead and move into our URLs. So my URLs right now, it has this single name and it has this all Pokemon. Well, how do I create a test case for this? We see that we have this test file, and this test file already has all kinds of Pokemon in there. Okay, so this has all the test file for one specific Pokemon, but it currently doesn't have any test files for any of my URLs. So we already have, I'm sorry, I'm seeing things populate in the chat, so I just want to make sure that I'm not missing something in the chat. Okay, so we already have a test case that's testing the Pokemon model in itself, but now I'm going to create a different test case class that will test the URLs. And I'm going to specify, hey, this is going to test the URLs. It's still going to take in test case, and I'm going to specify what it's going to do. So I'm going to go ahead and name it. This is going to be the first test. That test is the test case inside of this test suite. Or this test class, I apologize. And I want to test that I can get all of my Pokemon. Okay, so now how do I get all of my Pokemon? Well, the first thing that I want to do is make sure that I have the correct URL pattern and that I have the correct method or class that's attached to it. So now let's take a look here. Let's say, well, I know this is going to take in self. And now I'm going to say, well, what about the URL? I want to be able to grab the URL of which I'm going to or that I'm trying to test. So I'm going to specify the URL, grab reversed, and I actually need to import reverse and resolve up here from Django. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. And I believe that's coming from Django.urls resolve and reverse. Okay. And we'll go over into each one of those and what they do here shortly. So I'm going to grab those tools. And the next thing I need to do is I'm going to say, well, I want you to resolve something. So what is it resolving? When I think about resolving, I'm hearing, hey, I want you to send a specific request, or I want you to do something and just fix it or wait until it comes back completed. All right. So resolve is essentially saying, hey, I want you to grab this, analyze it, and grab all the key information out of this so that I can utilize it and test it and ensure that it's all coming back correctly. We can see here that it's expecting for me to put in a path. And so for the path, I could definitely do something like, oh, well, I want you to go to API/v1/Pokemon, right? And then that would have another slash. So essentially this would work, but this isn't necessarily a good programming concept because that means I would have to be writing this over and over and over again. And if at one point my company decides that we want to change the naming of this URL pattern, well, now I have to go back through all of these different files and change the specific URL pattern in every single file. So I don't want to do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reference to the name. And this is where the reverse comes in. So reverse is going to allow Django to look within itself without having to go into my actual URL patterns and do all of these crazy things like pinging itself through its internal workings. I'm going to tell it, hey, I want you to look for a specific Pokemon name or a specific URL pattern name. So now I'm going to pass in that all Pokemon. And that is in reference to, if I go over here, we know that I gave it a name of all Pokemon. So now this test suite knows that it's going to basically figure out what functions are attached to this URL pattern, what the response is going to look like, what the status of that response will be. And we'll go over into statuses here real quick as well. Okay, so now I have all of the URL pattern. That's great. But now what exactly is it that this URL pattern is offering for me? So let's go ahead and print it. Let's print URL, and then let's self.assert, and let's say true. And let's make it true so that we don't get a nasty test failure. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel out my console here. And instead of run server, I'm going to say test. Okay, so it looks like we have a couple of problems here. Let me see what is going on. Got 2 errors, and one of them is from a pre-existing one that I don't really want to worry about. The one that okay, both of them are pre-existing ones that I don't want to worry about. But instead, I'm going to come over here. We see these 2 dots, and then I see this resolver match. Okay, well, inside of this resolver match, we can see that it's basically attached to a tuple. This is a data type, right? The data type is resolver match, and these are the different things that are inside of it. Well, we can see that it has the function. So what function corresponds to that URL pattern? We can see that it has how many arguments are being put in there. We can see it has a URL name that I can also test for, but that would be redundant. And we can see that it has the route. Well, the route's something important, so I want to make sure that the route stays the same. So now what I'm going to use is something called subtest. We already went over how testing works in general, but subtest gives me a way of testing something within a test case, so I don't have to write an entirely separate test. And this is just avoiding me having to rewrite code over and over and over again. So now I can say I want to assert equals. And what I want to assert equals is going to be that the URL route is equal to API /v1 /Pokemon. Okay, and then currently right now this is freaking out, and that's because I'm not passing in something. Let's see, what is it that I'm not passing in? With self.subtest. No, I'm passing everything in correctly as far as I'm tracking. So let's see what's going on here. Maybe it needs to take in self. Nope, that ain't it. Oh, actually, I'm passing in this equal signs, and I don't need an equal sign. I need a comma. I apologize, everyone, my syntax. So it was self.assert equals. This is an assertion that belongs to Django, and it's going to assert these 2 parameters. It's going to take in the URL route that's coming back from this resolve function, and it's going to ensure that it's actually matching the route that I wanted to. Well, now if I run test, I'll still get those failures from other tests before, but we'll see that the new test that I created, which is test 001, it seems to have had an issue, and it's telling me, hey, I did not receive a closing slash, but I'm expecting to receive a closing slash. So let's go ahead and add that there. Okay, and now we see that that was able to compile successfully, and test 001 for all Pokemon was able to pass. Well, now the other thing that I would want to assert, other than just the URL route, is what function is attached into it. So let's go into that. I'm going to go ahead and say, well, I want you to make sure that URL.func.view, and this is going to check the function inside of the URL. And remember, we use that as view, so I can go ahead and say .view to check what it is. And because we use that as view, we want to make sure that this is tracking, hey, this function is not just a regular function. We want to look for a view class. And now finally I can say all Pokemon. So now that I have these yellow squigglies and it's saying it's not defined, can anybody tell me why this is happening here?
Do you need to import that class?
yeah, I need to import the class into this test suite now. So I'm gonna say from Pokemon app dot models import Pokemon. And now if I run it one more time. Okay, we seem to have gotten 3 errors, so let's check out what's going on here. So there's test 002 again, I don't care about that one. Test 01 as well, I don't care about that one. But name all Pokemon is still not defined.
You need to import all Pokemon, right? Not Pokemon.
That's
Yeah,
correct. And I
from
also
views,
need to
yeah.
import from views, yeah. There you go, so now when I run this, now we should only see 2 errors. So test 02, I don't care. Test 01, I also don't care. So now I know that my test was successful and that I built this URL pattern correctly. So now I can go back to the URL pattern and I can mess around with it, right? Let's say I go over to that view. Where is that view? Yeah, let's say I go over to the view and I say, well, I want you to print X, Y, and Z. Or I could even put some logic or something crazy in here. Well, when I run my test suite, regardless of what I do to this, as long as it's not broken, everything's still going to work correctly. And it's going to be able to identify what my function and what my URL pattern are. So it's going to allow me to basically make changes, run my test suite, and know that the changes that I made didn't break any of my prior logic. Okay. Great. So now we just went into testing. There's one more thing that we need to cover, and that's going to be creating our own endpoints other than just integers and strings. So let's take a little bit of time and let's come back and attack that here. Let's take 10 minutes, gather up our thoughts, and then come back with some questions. So I'll see everyone here at 2:45. Be back by now. All right, welcome back, everyone. Let's go ahead and take a look at the difference between our API so far and the Poke API. Well, we know that the Poke API in the end is supposed to return to us this specific response, right? And if we go back to our data, whenever we send our response, I can go ahead and say, hey, I want you to bring me back Pikachu now. And I don't have to specify by lowercase or uppercase letters. I may want to run my server before I do that. Right, I don't have to specify by uppercase or lowercase letters. But instead, although this is working great, the Poke API has the ability to where I can ping it by ID. All right, if I go ahead and go into Pokemon, ID of 1, well, returns to me Bulbasaur. If I go to 50 and I send that, it returns to me Diglett, and so on. So it's able to grab individual Pokemons by ID. Well, what if we want that to be the same thing? We want our specific Pokemon or our Poke API to return an ID as well. Well, I said that we can handle integers, right? And so that everyone can see what an integer looks like. An integer looks like this. But if I replace this by the integer, then we wouldn't be able to handle the string. Okay, so what now, right? What can I do if it's not able, it's only able to handle one or the other at a time, and it can't handle both. But the Poke API is able to do it, so there's got to be a way that we can replicate that behavior. What do you mean by table then?
Like, wouldn't we use them like as a primary key or something? Not necessarily.
Yeah, so we're essentially going to be looking as a primary key here. But what I mean is on the URL endpoints, we can only handle one or the other currently at a time. We can't handle both. So now we're going to go ahead and fix that. We're going to create our own endpoint. So let's we're going to create a new file where we're going to place any endpoints that we may have. We're going to turn this to converters.py. And here in converters.py, well, that's where anything that turns into a registered converter will go. So there's a couple of things that we'll need to import from Django. And again, since this is dealing with URLs, I know that I have to go into Django URLs. I want to import path. I'm sorry, I don't want to import path. Let me make sure I'm grabbing the correct information. Okay, we'll go into the import statements here shortly. So let's go into what this class is going to do. So we'll go ahead and start a class. And what I'm going to call this class is just going to be int or string. And I'm going to preface it with converter so that if anybody else looks at my code, they know this is supposed to be a converter. Okay, so now the easiest thing that I can do to ensure that regex is working properly, or to grab the correct information, which is either letters or a number, well, I can utilize regex. So here I'm going to start build. Did I spell it wrong? Conturver? Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. So now I can utilize regex. And so I'm going to build my own here. I know that I want it to be either 0 through 9. So it could be more than one digit of 0 through 9. Or I want it to be A through Z. It could be lowercase, or it could be A through Z, which could be uppercase. And I want it to have more than that. Okay. So now it's handling all of that. It's handling my regex.
Forget the R.
You have to have R, right?
Not yet. We will, but just not yet. So now let's go in there. Let's go ahead and specify what's going to happen with our values. So I'm going to create a function that will basically evaluate this function. So I'm just going to call this toPython because it's going to be talking to my Python. This toPython isn't something that's built in or anything. It's just a variable that I'm creating. And it's going to take in a value. Okay, well now what I want to do is I want to say, hey, if this value is a digit, then I want you to return the integer value. Else, I wanted to return the string. And actually, I don't need to return the string value. I could just return value. I'm being redundant there. Okay. And then lastly, I want to talk to the URL. It's going to take in self. It's going to take in value. And it's going to return the value. I cannot spell at all today. Thank you. I hope you guys are having fun correcting my spelling. All right.
Line 8 should be a return value.
Oh, thank you so much. Look at that. I'm losing my mind. All right. So now we have our regex. We have our function toPython, which is basically, hey, Python, I need you to do this in order to return something. And then my URL is just, this is what you're going to do. This is what I want my URL to be tracking. Okay. I built out this class with these two functions in a specific format. Why do I need this? My mind has been lost since OOP. Hey, Nick. We'll talk about that afterwards. I apologize. So now let's go ahead and say, well, what about this class? Why is this important? Let's go into, oh, I'm so sorry. I have this whole file opened up again. We're currently inside of my Pokemon app. Now let's go into our URLs. Well, now I'm going to say that I want to import that specific thing. So I'm going to say from converters, import integer or string. So now I have my integer or string converter. But there's a little bit of functionality that I can add on to that. And one of those things comes with Django with registering a path, registering a converter. Currently, I have a path, but if I go over to the next line, I can say register converter. Well, what does this do? Register converter is not accessed. And it tells me it needs a converter and a type. Like what is it that I want to convert things to, right? Or how is it that I want a reference to it? Well, let's go ahead and build out that function. Let's say register converter. The class that it's going to access is going to be integer or string. And then what about integer or string is it that I needed to do? Well, in that integer or string, I need it to go ahead and have a name. And this is how I'm going to reference it. So first, it takes in the converter. What is it that the functionality that it is that it's going to approve? And then secondly is the name. What is it that I want to call it? So I'm just going to call it int or string. So now if I change this to int or string, we should see that everything's able to register through my register.
It's int of string. That's what you typed.
Of course. Okay, so now it's able to register, it's able to recognize the correct one. And let's go into what happened in this int or string. What is this class doing? All right, let's go into the converter. To Python, what is this doing? This to Python is the logic that I wanted to utilize. What is it that it's actually going to return to the rest of my Python code? Is it going to just return the regular value, or is it going to return an integer? This regex, although I didn't set up with an R for regex, it's going to run the regex automatically. Django is going to pick up this class, identify this regex, and run it against anything that comes in. Is digit a method? Yes, it is a method. Mine ain't registering it either.
I'm pretty sure it's like, if I might be wrong. It's spelled differently. Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah, that.
Let me make sure. Let me look at the notes real quick to make sure. Yeah, it's is digit. I apologize. Thank you so much. You have is dig. Yeah. Okay, so now I have my is digit. It recognizes it is a digit. It comes out true. So it returns an integer value. Otherwise, it's just going to return the value in itself. And to my URL, well, my URL just needs the value. It doesn't need to know if it's what type it is that it's going to be handling. It just needs the value to be returned to it. So now that we created our own registry, let's take a look and make sure that our string method still works. So let's go ahead and send this. Okay, so the request still works, but what's going to happen when I turn it into an integer? Can anyone take a wild guess?
It still work.
It's gonna call the ID number of the Pokemon.
Yeah, we would. What is that regex doing within the function? So either that regex that I established, or because I called it regex, Django's gonna grab it and run it against the URL.
Just so it just
Like
grabs the value.
Not gonna work.
Yeah, so it's Django's built-in feature. Once I told it to go into a registered converter, it's going to go inside of that class. And if it sees the regex, the established regex being on there, it's going to grab it and run it against whatever it is that my parameter that I'm trying to pass.
Oh, okay. So we don't have to include the R part with that then?
Correct.
Okay.
All right. So now let's see what happens with one. Well, one goes through, right? And we know it went through successfully because I didn't get a 404. I instead got a 500 internal server. So let's take a look at what's going on here. Well, one, I'm trying to utilize title on a number, and we know that that's not possible. So currently right now, my view is not built out to handle a number function. So let's try to handle what this Pokemon is. Right? We have this Pokemon. And I'm going to make it equal to none for now. And then the next thing I'm going to say is I'm going to try. It's going to try to get a Pokemon by this specific value. And if that causes an error, well, then I'm going to say, well, in the exception where that causes an error, I want you to grab a Pokemon where the ID is equal to Pokemon name. Okay, and this is just me brainstorming off the top of my head. We could just handle this with if statements saying, hey, if the data type of Pokemon name is a string, then do this. If it's a digit, then do this. But I threw it inside of a try and accept at the time. So now let's try to take a look at what that looks like. When I hit this send, well, now it's able to come back. It was able to grab the ID of 1 and bring me back my specific Pokemon. Let's go ahead and do 3. But not 13 because that doesn't exist. Well, if I do 3, it also brings me back Blastoise and all the information that I want. Can I still type in Blastoise and send this request? Yes, I can. Okay. And what happens if I put in a bunch of stuff in there? Well, now when I send it, I get an error. It comes back to be a 500. And this is happening because it's able to recognize, it can put any type of string. And actually, let me try to see if I put special characters in there as well. And see if I could get a different failure. Okay, there you go. So now I put special characters in there that can't be handled by either string or by my regex. And because it's not handled by my regex, it's saying, hey, this endpoint isn't registered. I have no idea what it is. So it's returning a problem at that point. Okay. So in summary today, we've gone over folder structures, how to properly build out a view to interact with our model and grab information from the database through Django queries. We then went over JSON, serializers, and responses. We touched a little bit on Django REST frameworks, but we still have quite a bit to touch on REST frameworks as we go along. We went over testing for individual API views, URL patterns, and how to build our own converters for URL patterns. At this point, are there any questions over anything that we've gone so far? We have all the questions, but we're just done, aren't we? Okay, that's fair. Let's go ahead and let me stop the recording at this point.